Hi everybody, today we're going to make a project from November 2025 Perfectly Peace subscription box for anybody who's waiting patiently for the polar bear rice warmer. He's up next after this project. The November box has the Mitten Block. There are several different projects. I'm going to make the 6-inch project, which is the runner, but I'm going to make it a little bit differently. The project as shown has 5 of the Mitten Blocks. I'm actually going to make mine smaller like this with 3 of the Mitten Blocks because it will fit on a table by our front door where I set up my holiday decorations. Let's talk about a couple of supplies. For fusible backing, the only material I put fusible backing on this time is this little green knit material. That's the cuff of the mittens because it stretches. So I added fusible to the back of that. The rest of my fabric I use spray starch. Since I'm making my project smaller and I wasn't concerned about the fabric shrinking, I gave everything a spray with this faultless heavy finish. I pretty much soak the fabric and it does shrink your fabric. So if you want to make as many projects as you can out of this box, you wouldn't want to use this. You'll need your light mesh cutaway stabilizer. For each mitten block, I cut a 7-inch square of project batting. And I have scrap batting strips here that I'll use for my borders. I decided to use this as the backing fabric instead of the holiday print. And I'll be using this glide pearl thread that came in the box throughout the project. If you want to make a mini runner like I am, it's going to end up 22 inches long and 10 inches high. The way I do the borders, I'm going to end up with extra border fabric, and I'll explain that as we go along. When you add up the total distance around 22, 22, 10, and 10, it's 64. I would recommend cutting at least 74 inches of 2.5 strips to use for your binding. That gives you extra for overlap when you join and for folding for your mitered corners. The blocks I chose to work on are block A, B, and C. So I'm going to have a blue mitten, green mitten, and a pink mitten. All of this down here has to do with the border files. I will explain that. I cut 3 strips 3 inches wide with the fabric because they gave you yardage, and we can trim them when we're done. When we go to the machine to quilt out our borders, I'm going to show you the border files. There's some interesting measurements on the border files in this kit because the way the borders are designed. So we'll go over that when we do our borders. My backing fabric I cut at 24 by 12. Your finished size for the mini runner is going to be 22 by 10. And this gives you a little bit extra to work with to get everything centered when you're doing your stitch in the ditch to attach your backing. I've already done my fabric cutting. To help me, I crossed off the things I was not cutting. I would also change the quantities to make sure I didn't cut extra. Here's how I organized everything. Blocks A and C have the same background fabric here and here. Their colors are different, the knit's the same, and going down there's 2 more pieces of that background fabric. I have some pins. I've written on these with a Sharpie. You can see the numbers. So this is A1, C1, A2, C2, and so on all the way down. And B is over here because B has different background fabrics. This made it easier for me as I was cutting to keep my cutting straight. If that gets confusing for you, you can always lay out A, B, and C. It took me 2 boards to do this. These are 18-inch design boards. Here's the rest. So you've got 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then I have my binding and my borders. I have my light mesh cutaway loaded in 2 hoops because I can fit 2 blocks in my big hoop, which is a 9.5 by 14, and then I need 1 more. So I loaded some stabilizer in my 8-inch square hoop. In your box is printed instructions for the single block with quilting. That's what I'll be following along with today. The thing that helps the most when you're doing a project like this is this picture right here. It has everything numbered so you know where all the fabric is placed. We'll work on 2 together. That way you can see how to duplicate the block in your machine if you've never done that before. Load some stabilizer in your hoop and let's head over to the machine. I'm on a Baby Lock Meridian. My files are on USB and I have that glide pearl thread already on my machine. I won't be changing my thread at all during this project. We're going to need the 6-inch mitten. Here's my 6-inch block. I'm going to hit set. I'm going to put 2 in 1 hooping. I'm going to slide that up to the top. Hit edit. I'm going to use the border duplicate key. If this is your first time watching, you've got a regular duplicate key and a border duplicate key. If you use this regular duplicate key, it'll complete 1 start to finish and then do the second. When you use this border duplicate key, I'm adding 1 below, space them out a little bit. Now when you're ready to go, it does each step twice. So you work on them at the same time. These blocks have a lot of laying down fabric and folding and pressing and taping, so it's easier to work on both at the same time. One thing I want to do is add this to memory on my machine just in case. That way if something happens during the stitch out, everything stays where it needs to be. We're ready to go. The first thing we're going to stitch out is our batting placement line. I have my neutral thread on my machine. It's going to stitch out 2 batting placement lines. Grab your batting. I have a 7-inch square. Cover your placement line. I've got a piece of tape already stuck to the top of that batting. 1, and then you've got 1 down here. Now this part of the stabilizer is off the machine. So when I get this into position and I want to press down this tape, I want to put a hand underneath and support so I can push the tape down and it sticks. You don't want to shove this and then mess up your stabilizer. It's going to stitch the batting tack down line. You want to trim everything that's outside of that tack down line. I have my batting trimmed. The next thing that's going to stitch out is called a piecing template. Piecing templates have stitched out. I'm going to work on blocks A and C. They have the same color background fabric. It'll be easier to follow on camera. We're going to start with our piece 1 fabric. Piece 1 is right here. It's that part of the thumb of the mitten. You want to take your piece 1 fabric. It goes down here. Make sure you cover the whole thing. Lay it over, covering this piece 1. Right side up. You can tape your fabric if you want. It's sticking really well to the batting. I think it'll be fine, and I'm sitting here watching it. It's going to stitch a short little line right here. We want to trim away the extra right here. I'm going to grab my snips for this. Next is your piece 2 fabric. These are going to go right side down, short side, long side. You center it along that stitch line. See the little stitch line right there? Piece 2 fabric, right side down. Just like that. You can tape this if you want. Next we're going to stitch the seam. You're going to want to flip these up if you want. Take this over to your iron, press it. I'm going to use my fingernail on this one. I think it'll be fine. Yep, that's going to work. I have a little seam roller that I also use, but because I've got one on the bed and one not on the bed, I'm just going to use my fingernails this time. Once you've got these flipped up and pressed, we're going to stitch the next placement line. Same thing, trim everything that's outside of that line. So on this one down here, I've got this piece here and this piece here. Now something I've noticed about these projects, this is tacked down right here. Because remember, the first thing we stitched, tacked down this pink fabric, there's a little thread here. So you can't stitch this off unless you cut those threads. I usually will snip a couple of those threads and get a nice clean trim, especially because I don't have any fusible on my light colored fabric. You got your piece 3 fabric, same thing, lay it down, center it along that line. It's going to stitch a seam, and then we'll flip it and we'll press it. Same thing, flip it and press it. If you're using an iron, make sure you're taking it off the bed of your machine. Don't melt your machine. I'm just going with fingernails today. And then we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line, and that's going to go right along here. So I want to keep an eye on my machine, make sure that this doesn't get caught. I'm going to add a piece of tape just in case. This time we need to trim everything right here. I've got these trimmed. We want to get piece 4. That's your big piece of colored fabric. Right side down, centered along that stitch line, like that. And it's going to stitch a seam, and then we'll be flipping and pressing, and that will cover this part of the mitten. Because it's big, I'm going to go ahead and tape it. If you use tape, take the tape off, flip, press, just using the fingernail. Hand underneath for support, and I'm actually going to go ahead and retape this just to hold it nice and flat over to the side. Once you've got those pressed, flipped over, tape if you like. It's going to stitch another trimming and placement line. Trim everything outside of your trimming and placement line. Everything's trimmed. Grab your green knit fabric piece. Put fusible on the back if you haven't already. We want it to look like that. So we're going to place it right side down like this, centered along this line. I am going to tape this. It's a little puffy, a little squishy. Now normally, I've been pressing these with my fingernail. This has got some texture to it. I think my fingernail's going to ruin it. I'm going to use my seam roller. This one is off the machine, so let's try it on this one at the top. This is a Clover Seam Roller. It's plastic. I also have a bigger Lori Holt seam roller that's wooden. Let's just try this. It just kind of squishes your fabric. It's like a little rolling pin. That'll work fine. So I need to press that, and I'm going to add some tape. And then I need to pull this off the machine and get this one here pressed because there's no support underneath. I've got both of those rolled. I'm adding extra tape just in case. Let's stitch our next trimming and placement line. You want to do the same thing we've been doing. If you use tape, get rid of the tape, trim off the stuff that's down here. These are trimmed. You want to grab piece number 6. I'm going to place that right side down along the trimming and placement line, and I am going to tape it this time and keep an eye on it because this is puffy. Go ahead and take your tape off, flip, press, tape that down because it's got that extra puffiness. I'll definitely be pressing this before we do the quilting. The next trimming and placement line is going to be across the top. What's interesting is, see, I've got to trim this here. I've got nothing to trim there. I don't know if I cut this piece wrong or laid it down crooked, but it barely made it across the top. But it's there, it's fine. You want to grab piece 7, lay it down centered along that line, and then we're going to stitch the seam. So all the rest of this is going to be the background colored pieces of fabric. We have pieces 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, and they're all this brown colored fabric, and it's going to be the same thing. Stitching, trimming, placing fabric, flipping, folding, pressing, stitching seams, you get the idea. I'm going to go ahead and work through the rest to music. We've got pieces 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Have a look at this. I'm getting ready to do piece 8. It caught this fabric and it yanked it down. It looks okay. I know that I'm going to be trimming everything from this side out. When I go to do the next mitten down there, I'm going to make sure that it doesn't get caught. I looked away, no kidding, literally for about 2 seconds because I'm plugging in my camera. So what I've done is I've taped this. I actually stopped my machine. I'm going to start it. Stop it, start it, stop it, and now I'm going to start it and let it finish. I've got this in my lap. This is the top and this is the bottom, so it's upside down. My apologies. After you trim off this fabric, you'll see you've got some of the green here. This is really hard to get out. This is another spot where there's some stitching here that you might have to remove in order to trim away this little piece of green. There's some stitches right in there. Up to you if you want to fuss with that and try and get it out. I'd like to get that out because the green is definitely going to show. There's some stitches here too. I get a seam ripper or sometimes I just use the scissors and I just kind of do that. Get that out of the way, and then I'll get a piece of tape and get all this fuzz out of the way. Watch out for this. I'm going to do the same thing I did before. Let it stitch a couple of stitches. Stop my machine. Do a couple more stitches. Stop. Make sure that's going underneath. You can cover it with tape too. I just don't want to pick out the tape. I thought I'd be setting all this to music, but I guess not. Here's the line we just stitched. This has a tack down right there. You might need to pop some stitches to get all this green out. Piece 10. You're trimming everything on this side. Piece 11. I've got these flipped and pressed. One thing I noticed though is, do you see how this is overlapping into the top mitten? I want to go ahead and get the extra out of the way. I'm going to get rid of this little fabric flag. I saw that one coming too. This line may have done better going this way. Trim it out, we're good. back it up a little bit. Your machine probably has a needle minus plus. I've shown that before on several videos. I'm going to hit that. I'm going to go back, I don't know, 5. I'm going to hand crank and see where that is. That's good. I'll go with 5 and I'll finish stitching this out. This is turning into a real adventure. We want to trim everything outside of this stitch line, and then we're going to place our piece 12. Let's place piece 12. If your iron isn't on, turn it on. I just plugged in my iron because I am going to give this a press before we do the quilting. Piece 12 and piece 12. And I did have to pop a few stitches here and here to be able to trim off the little corner of the colored fabric, just like with the green part. At this point, I want to take this over to my ironing board. I plugged in my mini iron. I'm going to flip and press, and you see I'm going to have to trim this because it's going to cover this block. Flip and press. Before you press, if you have any paper tape left, like I do, I've got quite a bit here, don't iron over the paper tape. It turns brown, it burns, it smells, and it gets on your iron. You can guess how I know. I'm going to take this over, flip, press, double check, make sure nothing's overlapping, and then we're going to come back for the next step. Everything is nice and pressed. We have 2 more things to stitch out. The first is a trimming line. It's going to stitch a box outside of each mitten, and then after that we're going to stitch our quilting. I'll go ahead and run those 2 things together. Do you see what just happened? It got caught again. So even though I've pressed this, this got caught. This has a really ugly fold. I'm going to cut my thread and I'm going to pick out this part of the quilting. If you ever have to pick out part of your quilting, one of the easiest ways I think to do this is to flip it to the back and snip every couple bobbin thread stitches, and then when you pull from the top, it's easier to get it out rather than picking and risk ripping your fabric. I picked that out, it took me about 5 minutes, sprayed it with water, got it nice and wet, and then put a dry iron on top of it. That gets the little holes out when you have to pick stuff out. I've backed up my machine. I'm going to watch this, maybe slow it down a few times as it stitches this part and make sure it doesn't get caught. These 2 are done. Wow, I need to go get a cookie. I'm going to set these aside, and then I have to make 1 more mitten. I'll do that off camera. We're going to work on the borders next, and then we'll trim everything and assemble it together at the end. We're ready to move on to our borders. Let's talk about how to pick which border file you need for this project. This project is a little bit different. Let me bring up the border files and show you what I'm talking about. Here's our border files. They give you 1 inch and 2 inch, but we're going to be working with the 2 inch today. So when I was setting this up, I thought, okay, we've got 10, 12, and 14. Here's something to look at. Let's bring up the 2x10. Right here at the top, 2.5 inches wide, 8.70 inches long. This is the 10 inch file. It's 8.7 inches long. Why? Because of the pattern. If they were to make this 10 inches long, I think you'd have half a snowflake. And then when you would go to do your repeat, you'd have 2 snowflakes instead of the snowflake, a set of mittens, snowflake, a set of mittens. That's why it's short. Always look at this. Now, again, 10 inch file, 8.7 long. Let's go back. 12 inch file, 8.7 long. It's the same thing. They can't build in another full repeat without making it longer. Let's look at the 14 inch. Our 14 inch has that extra repeat. Do you see that? That made the file 13.05 inches long. It's not 14 inches, it's 13.05 inches long. This is what I'm going to be working with today. Now remember, I'm making a mini runner. You're going to have the 2 side borders, which if you're making the full runner, you're still going to have the 2 side borders and then the longer borders. So when I sat down and was starting to figure out, okay, well, if I trim the 2 small pieces and then I trim long pieces and how I put them in the hoop, it kind of got ridiculous. The most efficient way for me to do this is to use this 14 inch file, which is actually 13.05 inches long. Put 3 at a time in a hoop and then do 2 hoopings and then trim and piece my borders together. Otherwise, if I want to go back, let's say I decide pick either the 2x10 or the 2x12, it doesn't matter, because your side borders are 6 inches. They border along that 6 inch block. You could use this, but you are going to trim it anyway because it's going to be 8.70 inches long. So rather than do 2 hoopings where I make the 2 short sections and then I do another 2 hoopings for the long section, that's 3 hoopings. So the easiest way to do that is to do 3 of these at a time, and I only need to do 2 hoopings instead of 3. Here's the first one. Use your border duplicate key. Spread them out. We're ready to go. I have 3 strips of fabric. Now I cut mine 3 inches wide. It tells you to cut them 2.5 inches wide, but if you remember when we were looking at the single strip, it was 2.5 inches wide. So if you cut your fabric 2.5 inches wide, when you go to do the tack down, you're probably going to be really close to that fabric tack down line. I like to give myself a little bit of extra space, and since I'm making a smaller project, I'm not worried about running out of the fabric. I'm going to hit OK, save it to memory, and we're going to get started. I have my neutral thread on my machine and we're going to be working with scrap batting. We'll go ahead and step through this. We do 1 run, and then when we do the next run, we join the strips. I'll show you how to do that. I still have the pearl thread on my machine. I'm not going to change it. My machine's going to stitch out 1, 2, 3 batting placement lines. You can see I've got 3 sets of placement lines here. Let's measure these. I'm working with scrap batting. These are 2 inches apart, so I probably want something that's at least 2.5 inches wide because we're going to do a tack down and then trim. If it's 2 inches wide, it's going to land right on those lines. I've got a strip right here. That's easily going to cover that, and I can see that it's long enough. So I'm going to trim off the bottom. That looks good. Look at that. I'm going to grab some tape and put some tape across the top. Once you've got them taped in place, make sure they're nice and smooth. You can tape the bottom too if you want. It's going to stitch out a tack down line. It's going to go around twice on each strip. The batting tack down lines are all stitched out. You want to trim everything that's outside of the tack down line. Once you've got those trimmed, put your hoop back on. It's going to stitch a fabric placement line. Our fabric placement lines have stitched. I'm going to measure these. Remember the instructions tell you to cut your border fabric 2.5 wide. That's the exact width of that tack down line. That's why I cut my border 3 inches wide, which sometimes you can't do if you're limited because you're working with a fabric kit. So you have to think ahead. If you're making the full runner project, you'd have to measure and see if you have enough fabric to cut these 3 inches wide. One thing you could do is they give you enough fabric to use this for your borders and the backing. Put something else on the backing. I've done that. And then you could cut these 3 inches wide. You want to cover those tack down lines. Now remember I told you I also cut these with the fabric, and because we're going to join, anything extra is just going to hang down the front of your hoop. Your concern here is to make sure you cover that fabric placement line. Let me grab some tape. I always tape these, one at the top, and then your placement line ends at the same point that your batting ends. You can put a piece of tape at the bottom. I've got these all laid over the fabric placement lines, and they go past on the top, so you can extend it a little bit beyond. On the top we'll be trimming these to fit, and I've got my tape at the bottom. The next thing it's going to stitch out is the fabric tack down. If you're working with 2.5 inch strips, you just have to sit here and watch it. You may have to tape all the way down. Everything's tacked down. The next thing it's going to do is stitch out the quilting. Don't trim your fabric right now. Stitch out your quilting. These have stitched out. We're going to take this over to the table. We're over at the table. We're going to take this out of our hoop and we're going to separate our strips. We're not cutting on any of the lines or anything. We're just going to separate them from each other. Before I set these aside, I'm going to trim this extra stabilizer right there. You're not cutting any of your fabric at this point. We're just getting rid of the extra stabilizer. Once they're all separated, set them aside for now. Rehoop some stabilizer. We're going to go over to the machine. We're back at the machine. What we're going to stitch out is batting placement, place our batting, tack it down, trim it, and fabric placement. After the fabric placement line, we're going to head back over to the table. I'll set the first few steps to music. over at the table, what we're going to be doing is lining up our strips with these fabric placement lines. I'll zoom in. Here's one on this side, and you've got a strip that's partially quilted, and then that's just fabric. Here's the quilted part. I'm going to fold the fabric part on top, slide this up to the top of this batting. What you're trying to do is match up your lines. You've got the fabric placement line here and here, and then you can also see them on the back of your strip, and then you've got this line here, and of course your batting. You're essentially matching it on the back to make it look continuous on the front. I usually like to go like this, and I look at where my lines are, and then I roll it down, and then just scooch and roll until that top line matches, and then I can also pull it back and look again. It's really hard to see on camera. My apologies. I should have stitched it in a different color so it would be easier to see, but I've done this on several of my videos before. You match up your lines. If you need to see this a little bit better, you can look for any one of my other videos with a project that has borders, and I'll either be doing the same thing again in that video, or I'll link another video below that'll have borders. But what you're doing is trying to make this look continuous. Smooth your fabric, tape it at the top. I'm going to tape it at the bottom, and I will tell you, if you're off a little bit, maybe a thread width or two, it won't matter. The quilting will still look continuous. Once you've got everything taped in, we're going to go over to the machine. When you put your hoop on the machine, make sure this part hangs over the back of your table. I'm ready to stitch out the fabric tack down line. I can see the line up here on the part that's already done. Here's the unquilted part of my strip. You can hand crank your needle. I'm right in line with the tack down line above. If you're way off, take your tape off, reposition, and retape. But if you're within like a needle's width, a thread's width, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. I'm going to stitch the tack down. When it goes over to the next strip, I'll stop it, I'll check the positioning, and then I'll stitch it. I want to go ahead and get some of this tape off. I don't want it to get caught in the quilting. The quilting is done. I'm going to take this over to my table, separate the strips out like before, and set them aside. We're going to start with trimming our blocks, then we'll trim our border strips, then we'll assemble everything. The first thing we want to do is separate our blocks. Let's grab one of our blocks. I've got a rotating cutting mat here. I'm going to use my 6.5 inch square orange pop ruler for this. If you've never used these before, what you do is you line up that trimming line that's stitched out with the inside of the ruler, and then I'm going to grab the next size. That helps me have a space to hold on to it. Helps you have hand placement. That looks good. I'm also going to grab my little tin of clips. It's like a paperweight. If you've never used these before, you start in the notch and you trim along and you go to the top. This is my left side. It's backwards. If you're right-handed, your rotary cutter blade is on this side, so you trim over here. If you're left-handed and your rotary cutter blade is on this side, you would trim over here. Once you've got everything in place, you place your rotary cutter right here in that notch. Move it as far over to the left as you can. Make sure it's all the way over. You cut from notch to notch. Rotate. Do the same thing. Next side. I shifted my block. That looks good. Honestly, if it's a little bit off, it's just not going to matter. And the last side. Ready to go. I've got 2 more mittens to trim. Let's talk about trimming our borders. I cut with the fabric strips. Before I trim this off, I measured. I have 26 inches of quilted material for 3 strips. That's more than enough. The first thing I'm going to do is trim off this extra fabric. Now we want to trim these to 2.5 inches wide. I'm going to set 2 of these aside. We'll work on one. We've got 2 fabric tack down lines here on the front. One thing I've noticed is if I line this up right here, this is a 2.5 inch ruler, here's where the other line is. If you cut on these lines from the front, you're cutting 2 1/4, not 2 1/2. Cut them from the back. When you look on the back, we've got some outside stitch lines right here. Those are the fabric placement lines. Here's my 2 1/2 inch ruler. Here's one line there and one line there. Those lines, the fabric placement lines that you can only see from the back, are 2 1/2 inches wide, which is the width that you want. If you can't see them very well and you want to cut from the front, you can, but you need to add 1/8 of an inch this way and 1/8 of an inch this way. I think I did that on my Star Spangled Beauty ladder quilt, and it does work. But since then, I've done several projects with borders, and I find it easier to trim from the back because you can trim right along those outside lines. Something that would have made this easier, and I really need to try to remember to do this when you're working on borders, when you do the fabric placement line, if you stitch it in a darker thread, when you flip it to the back, you'll be able to see it, and it's a lot easier to trim. I'm going to trim all of these to 2 1/2 inches wide. This strip is done. I need to trim my other 2 strips. I'll go ahead and do that off camera. These are all trimmed. I'm going to set these aside. We need to start putting our runner together. I'm only doing 3 blocks, and I'll do blue, then green, then pink. It matches the picture. Right sides together, 1/4 inch seam, and then I'm going to press it open because we're going to be using Stitch in the Ditch to attach this to the backing. I'll go ahead and do these 2 seams and bring it back and show you. Here's my 3 blocks. We want to do our side borders first. I'm not concerned with the pattern and where I cut it to trim. What I will be watching for though is the mittens. Here's the tops of the mittens. I want them to face out, like the hand facing out. I'm going to grab this piece. I'm going to cut it a little bit long. I know I have plenty of border. I'm not worried about it. There's that piece. And then I'm going to cut another piece, same length. Now I have 2 side pieces. This piece has the mittens going this way, like that. I want that like that. And now this piece I need to turn, and that's going to go on this side. Like that. Now I can kind of see where the pattern is. I've got a snowflake, 2 mittens, and a snowflake. I'll go ahead and center that. I want to grab a clip. Let's check the other side. I have a full mitten, a snowflake, and 2 full mittens. I'm going to clip that. I'm going to sew these on. These I ended up pressing toward the center. It was easier. I've got a little bit extra on either side. I want to even that up before I attach my top and bottom border. If you've never had to even up borders before, you do match across your top here. That's already trimmed. But you see the seam line right here, that's nice and straight. I pick a line on my ruler, line it up with that seam so I know that's straight, and then I line up the edge. That way I know I'm cutting everything straight. Now we need to add our top and bottom borders. Mine are plenty long enough. I have extra on this side, extra on this side. I need to find where the mittens are. Here they are, pointing up. This is ready to do Stitch in the Ditch and binding. I'm going to do that off camera, but I will link below videos showing how to do Stitch in the Ditch and binding in case you're new. Where I would stitch these is here, 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 and here, and then a long stitch there, and right there. Make sure when you put your backing on, you've got the right side facing out. Like that. If you'd like to label your things, there'll also be a video below showing you how I label some of my projects. Here's the back side. I put a little tag on it. I have all my information written underneath. Let's get a look at the front. There it is. Isn't that cute? And this is the perfect size for our little table by the front door. This is going to be great for displaying all my holiday items. We made 3 6-inch blocks, added our borders. I used the red for the binding, and I changed my backing to the red instead of the holly. I think you could easily put together the 5 mitten runner in one day if you prep all your fabric and materials the day before and then do your embroidery and putting it together the next day. Thank you so much for joining me for the Perfectly Pieced November 2025 Mitten Block project. Just a quick reminder to everybody, starting January of next year, Perfectly Pieced is going digital only. I have a really fun project for for Perfectly Pieced next year. It's going to run the whole year. If you have trouble pulling fabrics, make sure you subscribe. Stick with me when we get into next year. We'll talk a little bit about color and pulling fabric and working with the digital version. Please be sure to like, subscribe, share with your embroidery friends. Thank you so much for joining me. See you next time.